Homo sapiens migration. While Homo sapiens were decidedly more advanced than other hominids, when they first moved out of Africa some 45,000 years ago, they were only equipped with stone tools for hunting and cutting. Despite those initial limitations, 30,000 years later Homo sapiens would inhabit almost every environment on Earth and had a presence in every continent except Antarctica. Homo sapiens in fact moved further and faster than all other hominids. While it is hard to attribute a single factor to all Homo sapiens migration, we do see that multiple human societies required migration to arrive at a more sophisticated level of development. Homo sapien migration accelerated close to 40,000 years ago, where humans reached continental Eurasia. Modern humans, 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, completed the migration to all the continents except Antarctica, moving first into Australia, eastern Siberia, the Pacific margins, Japan, and the Americas. Then from 10,000 years ago to 1,500 CE, humans arrived in the Arctic, the Indian Ocean, the deep Pacific, and tropical rain forests. Migration occurred in a staccato pattern with easiest areas colonized quickly, while more difficult areas remained uninhabited for thousands of years. A region's easiness is calculated from estimates about available plant and animal biomass and net productivity, that is, how quickly it returns, in each habitat. For example, tropical savannas and grasslands of East Africa were colonized first as the biomass there sustained the first bipedal hominids. Hominids first left sub-Saharan Africa, through the northern savannas, up the Nile corridor or across the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb to the Arabian Peninsula. 7 Evidence exists of Homo erectus in Morocco, Chad, and Algeria, and it appears that they eventually left Africa via the Arabian Peninsula. After leaving Africa about 1.5 million years ago, choppers, hand axes, and spheroids found at sites like Ubaidia in Israel put Homo erectus in the Levant. Some scholars argue for, and at the Jordan Valley 500 to 600,000 years ago. Asia. Some evidence suggests the presence of Homo ergaster and Homo erectus as having occurred in Java over 1 million years ago. Chinese Homo erectus fossils date between 800,000 to 400,000 years ago. Homo sapiens began to leave Africa around 40,000 years ago, and hunter-gatherers appeared in China by the end of the last ice age, 36,000 to 16,000 BCE, as continental ice in Central Asia began to melt. Europe. Animal bones and pebble tools place hominids near Rome just before the beginning of the Middle Pleistocene, 730,000 years ago. This seems to be the first hominid incursion into Europe. Hominid remains in Spain suggest colonization in Iberia up to 2 million years ago. But there are not nearly enough remains, no more than 20 inhabitants in any given site, to provide any certainty in terms of which hominids they correspond to or when they lived there. Either way, colonization of Europe can be considered late. This tardiness may have been related to a lack of animal food sources. Not until around 500,000 years ago did new species of deer, bovid rhino, and horse appear. 8 in Europe. Around the same time, the cheetah, saber-toothed tiger, and dirk-toothed cat declined in the region, making more carcasses from the aforementioned species available to hominid foragers. Australia, Papua New Guinea, Sahul. Evidence of tools from 30,000 years ago exists in Australia, and from even longer in New Guinea. The lack of a dry land crossing to Sahul, the land mass that once connected New Guinea and Australia, meant that an ocean journey of somewhere between 65 and 100 kilometers was required from mainland Asia. This made Australians and New Guineans the first seagoing colonizers. Once in Sahul, how humans populated Australia is still the subject of some debate between those who support the coastal hugger theory and those who support the idea of population by overlanders. The more difficult of the two means of populating Australia is overland, as it is more arid than the coasts, and the evidence for tools overland is not as advanced as that for the coast. Peopling the New World. North and South America were the last continents to be settled by humans. Most scholars think that the Americas were populated from Beringia overland. Around 12,000 years ago, mammoth hunting became more common and supported larger populations on both the Asian and American sides of Beringia, a landmass now divided by the Bering Strait, which at that time connected North America and Asia. On the Asian side, outlines of houses with stone-lined hearths have been found, remnants indicating permanent settlement that didn't necessarily have colonization as an end goal. But colonize they did, one group pushing southward between 10,000 and 3,000 years ago and establishing settlements that would become the origins of modern Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and Inuit populations. Another group migrated southeastward through Alaska, their descendants making it as far as Chile and Argentina. While we know about when American colonization began, the pace and means of colonization are still debated. Complicating the discussion of timing is the fact that the late Wisconsin ice sheet blocked the overland route from about 30,000 years ago, when two sheets merged, up until about 12,000 years ago, when they opened after a thaw. At this point in time, only a handful of sites support possible pre-10,000 BC occupation: Monte Verde in Chile, Meadowcraft near Pittsburgh, and Page Latson in Florida. As recently as 2015, excavations at Monte Verde and Chinchihuapi have strengthened the possibility of an earlier human presence on the continent, to as far back as 17,000 BC. In sum, the exploration was neither extremely heroic nor extremely risky, but instead was calculated and not left to chance. Hunter-gatherers. Chapter 2 explores the importance of farming to the creation and expansion of early civilizations. However, farming was only invented 13,000 years ago, meaning that for most of human history, our food has come through foraging. Early hominids like Australopithecines, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus ate mostly plant food. Homo sapiens became more sophisticated foragers as they began to fish with hooks and, more recently, nets, and as they used stone grinding tools to produce flour. As food gathering techniques evolved for these Paleolithic foragers, so did their behavior as organized groups. Modern humans became mobile to prevent resource depletion. They controlled population through dispersion or infanticide, and they began to live and work cooperatively. Modern foragers also began to divide tasks and share food with others, a feature that distinguishes them from other animals like chimpanzees that live in communities but feed individually. Sharing food is, of course, much easier to do when there is a surplus, and, with increasing tool use, Paleolithic humans became even more adept at foraging, leading to the higher likelihood of food surpluses. Tool use not only helped humans live cooperatively, but it also may have helped hominids develop abstract thought. Evidence of tool use may give us a clue as to when this development began. We know that other animals use tools, but even as long as 2.6 million years ago, we see evidence of the creative thinking required to make more effective tools. Homo habilis, in fact, takes its name, handyman, from the fact that they were the first known hominid toolmakers. Soon after individual tools appeared, the Oldowan industry became the first widely used toolset, consisting of flaked and smashed quartz, riverside pebbles made into poorly formed choppers and sharp stone flakes, and lasted for 1 million years with little change. From 2.6 to 1.5 million years ago. 10. The Oldowan were followed about 1.5 million years ago by hand axes that remained unchanged for more than 1 million years. Many scholars argue that these smaller-brained hominids like Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, and Australopithecus were both unable and unwilling to innovate much beyond their simple but effective tools, especially considering how harsh their environment could become. Fire was another important tool, first used by Homo erectus about 1.6 million years ago. Fire would become important to migrants to colder climes in Europe and Asia into foragers who could now eat foods that were poisonous if ingested raw. Homo erectus also cooked foods they had previously eaten raw, thereby expanding their lifespan by eliminating toxins found in raw meats. Homo sapiens would add more meat to their diet when advances in toolmaking led to an increase in big game hunting during the late Pleistocene. For example, excavations near Dolny, Vídeňa in the Czech Republic have helped reveal a society that used mammoth remains not only for meat but for fuel, construction, jewelry, and portable art. The inhabitants of Dolny, Vídeňa also made thousands of ceramic figurines, bird bone flutes, and ivory carvings of human heads. The cave paintings of Lascaux also reflect this increased skill as hunters and painters both. The colors and types of paint they used were vibrant and durable, and the scenes they depicted demonstrated their use of diverse hunting techniques. There we see depictions of humans hunting not only deer, but also woolly rhinoceros and mammoths. Also at Lascaux, we see evidence that hunter-gatherers had both religious beliefs and gender-specific tasks, reflecting a sophistication that we usually only attribute to sedentary humans. The fact that humans and animals were depicted together so often at Lascaux may be evidence of a belief that man descended from these animals. Or perhaps the bison, rhinoceri, and birds were painted on the walls to produce hunting magic, designed to make expeditions more successful. Finally, it was mostly men depicted in these higher-risk hunting activities, suggesting that women were the artists, participated less in the hunt, or both. Closer to the Neolithic era, societies began to experience a growing role for women reflected through their representation in Venus statuettes. See Figure 1.5. As we get closer to the Neolithic era, we see the relative role of women increasing, their place in ritual increases, their stature increases, their economic importance increases, and their childbearing uniqueness becomes more greatly emphasized. Increased sophistication was not limited to big game hunters, however. Campsites, rock art, and burial sites near Lake Mungo in Australia reveal how these early humans used pottery for cooking and had a diverse diet of birds, fish, and shellfish. A diet that seems to have kept them well nourished. 11. Australia was a society of hunter-gatherers until European colonization. Mobility was essential. With the continent's lack of widespread rainfall and rich soil, as a result, Aboriginal Australians needed an extensive knowledge of their terrain and where to move when. Tasmanians would ambush wallabies at their seasonal grazing territory, while Aborigines in the central deserts had to know when water holes would go dry. We also learned from the remains of Australian Aborigines that foragers could be quite complex if they continued to hunt and gather for thousands of years. Aborigines painted, developed advanced weapons like the boomerang, warred against one another, developed creation myths, passed down oral histories, and played musical instruments,